Welcome to Becoming an Ayn Rand Hero, where we use the ideas of Ayn Rand to create a life and a lifestyle with the qualities of an Ayn Rand hero. To use the challenges and opportunities of our daily life to create a story of heroic meaning that we can't wait to wake up to. And today, my guest is Marsha Enright, who is a longtime objectivist, someone who I have admired for many years, and who's doing really interesting work bringing this rational framework, this objectivist framework to the world in schools, in companies, and in groups. And it's just a real honor to have you here, Marsha. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the wonderful introduction and the opportunity to talk to you.
Yes. Yeah. So I like to start off to get a sense for who you are and what your story is with how did you get introduced to Ayn Rand? What is your story of discovery with her?
Sure. Well, I was intellectual from the time, probably from about 12 or 13, when I kind of woke up to the idea of ideas. Mm-hmm. The first book that introduced me to logic was Isaac Asimov's book, I, Robot.
Yes.
I just reread it to see what I hadn't read it since I was 12, and I reread it, and it's really good in that respect. And when I was 16, I was in a social studies class in high school, and my teacher was a kind of a classic old line Democrat, but he very much believed in free speech, free thought. You're making up your own mind. And even though it was 1969, he had what's now called the Nolan chart, which is the graph, which supposedly David Nolan invented in 1970. So I don't know how that happened. And I asked my teacher maybe 10 years ago. He said he didn't know where he got it from. So he had the Nolan chart. And at that time, Ayn Rand, the Nolan chart is how much do you agree with economic and personal liberty? And it's on a X and Y axis. So totalitarians believe in almost nothing. So they're down in the corner there.
No economic liberty, no social liberty.
Yeah, no social liberty. At that time, especially the Democrats or the lefties tended to believe in social liberty but economic controls, and the conservatives or right people believed in economic freedom but personal controls. And Ayn Rand was basically the only one in what's now called the libertarian corner in 1969. So he wanted us to read a novel from two of the quadrants. And so I chose The Fountainhead. At that time, I had been involved in things like our Eggheads group in high school, discussion group, and I considered myself a socialist because that seemed like the only intellectual idea
group
around,
out there.
Right. And I read The Fountainhead, and I said, wow, this is everything I've always thought, but organized really well with a lot more justification, So that got me into Ayn Rand, and after that I just started reading everything I could get my hands on. I read Atlas Shrugged the next year. Then I just started going through all the books, and I read, I got the Objectivist and the Objectivist newsletter and the Ayn Rand letter, and I read everything by her. And I took her dictum, check your premises, very seriously. So I spent a lot of time checking her premises. Like before, even though they seemed really right to me, I wanted to make sure, did they really comport with everything I knew and what I saw and my experiences and things like that. So I spent a lot of time doing that. So that's how I got involved.
Mm-hmm. And so in the process of checking her, how did you go about checking her premises? Did you use other philosophical writings to examine her, or did you just go through and think through, well, she's saying this, is that really true?
Mostly I went through and thought through it, and is that really true? And then as I went along over the years, I would read other writers and compare what they said to what she said, or I would read people that she referred to, although sometimes it was very frustrating because she didn't name who she was talking about a lot of times. Mm-hmm. So but I'd eventually come across somebody and then go, oh, wow, yeah, this is obviously the kind of ideas, at least, that she's talking about, and what do I think about this? Or I would read the people she referred to in her, she had an Ayn Rand column in the LA Times at one point, and so she referred to different writers there. In the Ayn Rand letter, she referred to people. So I did a lot of extra reading on top of that. And then I also read Brandon's The Psychology of Self-Esteem, and learned a great deal from that, and dug into his footnotes and read a lot of the writers that he referred to in the footnotes.
Mm-hmm. So, bringing in more of the psychological side,
right,
as well as the philosophical side.
Right, exactly. So.
Okay, and then did you go to school? Did I know that you have a history of actually speaking with Rand and participating in those kinds of situations. I'd love to hear about that. But did you go to school? Did you get degrees? Like, how did that? Sure. How did being introduced to Ayn Rand and having really thought through her ideas, how did that shape how you read everything else moving forward?
Sure. Well, I went to Northwestern University and I majored in biology. I thought I was going to wanted to go to medical school. But then at a certain point, my dad was a doctor. Mm-hmm. And at a certain point through maybe my junior year or something, I figured out, no, I was really more interested in the psychological side of things. So I decided to go to graduate school instead. And I ended up at the New School for Social Research, which is now New School University. Mm-hmm. Now, you have to understand, this was in the 70s. So at that time, the psychology departments were totally dominated by behaviorism and Freudianism. If you were in the medical schools, you studied Freud. If you were in the psych grad schools, it was behaviorism. Well, the New School was one of the only schools that was different. They had been founded by Gestalt psychologists, and they had a lot of what were then called the third wave psychologists in there. I had a very famous client-centered psychologist, Carl Rogers.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes.
Yeah, and I had.
So he was one of your teachers or professors? You worked with Carl Rogers?
Not Carl Rogers, a fellow who studied.
Oh, a fellow who studied that kind.
Yeah.
Yes.
Marvin Frankel. Frankel. Yeah, and also I did have some of the students of Kafka and Köhler, who were the founders of Gestalt psychology. Mm-hmm. I had a very interesting incident with one of them named Mary Henley, where we were supposed to do a research project. And so I gave her a proposal that I'd like to do an experiment on whether people's basic views of the universe, or what you call metaphysical views, are reflected in their artistic choices. And she asked me, is this somebody's theory? And I said, yes, the philosopher Ayn Rand. And she said, you call her a philosopher? And I just was like, oh God, the typical intimidation, right? Uh-huh. And I said, yes. I said, what have you read of hers? Well, she'd only read Anthony.
Wait, pause for a moment. That question, you have an opinion about Ayn Rand? What have you read of her?
Exactly.
Right? It's one of my favorite questions to ask, because there's a really nice correlation I found between people who admire Ayn Rand and people who have read Ayn Rand. And people who do not admire her and who have not read her. I just want to.
Right, yeah. And so I asked her what she'd read. All she'd ever read was Anthem. She said, but my friends don't think she's very respectable. Well, I didn't say this to her because, I'm the grad student, but I just thought to myself, for God's sake, the Nazis were respectable in Germany. What kind of standard is that for an intellectual? It's whether it's true or not, So anyway,
given your response to that, right? This seems to be, I'm imagining a leitmotif through your whole thing. It's like you read Ayn Rand and you're like, but is this really true? Let me check the premises. If I'm going to take this stuff seriously, does it go all the way down to metaphysics? Does it go all the way down to reality? Is it true? And it sounds like that's a thread that you've been pursuing ever since. Is that fair to say?
Well, what don't you think that one of the basic ideas that comes across, this certainly comes across in the Fountainhead, is look at reality for yourself. Mm-hmm. That your primary job is to look at things firsthand. So that means questioning everything. That means finding out what is the relationship between any idea and reality. And one of the principles that Rand talks about, and I think it's in Philosophical Detection, mm-hmm. which is an essay in I forget what book it's in, is to ask if you took this idea and you actually lived it, what would it do? And that's a great idea, great way to kind of think through what are the practical implications of any idea, you know?
Yeah. So to lead into where I imagine the conversation will go, so in Rand's 5 major categories, when she stood on one foot to describe her philosophy, she said metaphysics, reality, epistemology, reason, ethics, rational self-interest, politics, laissez-faire capitalism. And she could have said, I don't know why she didn't, aesthetics, romantic realism. Right? These 5 things. The thing that I believe makes her thought so important in terms of method, and I know you really care about her method, so I want to get into that, is that it's not that you do any one of these things. It's not that you do metaphysics or epistemology or ethics or politics or aesthetics. It's that they all must be congruent. They all must be coherent. That's what makes something wholesome. That's what makes it good. And so lots of people do epistemology, but they don't actually check it with reality. Oh, I've got a moral theory, but how does it fit to reality? I've got a political theory, but how does it fit to reality? And this, when you say, well, it seems like this is obvious, you work with a lot of people introducing them to these kinds of ideas. It seems to me, when I go out in the world, it's not obvious at all. It should be the most obvious thing ever. It's like, how does it fit in reality? Because if it's not in reality, it doesn't matter. It's not going to help. It's mostly just going to mislead.
Yes, absolutely. But you know, there's all these, any kid that's intellectual has already been introduced to all these ideas that there is no reality. You can't know reality for sure. Maybe it's a dream. I mean, so many confusing ideas that it's not easy to take that point of view. You know, you're kind of like the child in The Emperor's New Clothes. It's basically, I mean, I feel like that so much. You know, if I come across somebody who's telling me, oh, well, you know, there are multiple realities and you can't know reality for sure. And I'll just sit there and say, oh, I guess you know that for sure. How do you know that? You know, and they half of the time they don't even understand what I'm asking. It's really interesting how much their minds are confused, so that they don't realize the obvious contradiction in what they're saying. You know.
Yes, and one step further, it seems, and this was one of Ayn Rand's critiques, certainly in Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, but just overall. It seems that people have a vested interest in confusing them. Because if people fail to ask the question, does this actually test out in reality? Is this philosophically coherent, or is it contradictory? If you can get people to avoid that question, to delegitimize that question, then you can feed them anything. And as long as you can tap into their emotions, they'll go, that sounds right to me.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So this gets directly into great connection stuff. But before we get there, so
you want to talk about Rand?
Yeah. How? What was? Okay. I know that you actually interacted with her, and
sure.
like many, and I call myself a Randroid with love, right? because like no one's going to tell me that actually agreeing with Ayn Rand to the point where almost everything I say is consistent with her, like almost like an android, like if someone's going to say that that's a bad thing, I will own that. Because when you deal with all 5 areas and you actually work to integrate them and you check your premises and you make sure that it's coherent, I've studied a lot of other systems, but it always comes back. If it's not consistent with Ayn Rand, it's a problem. So I call myself a Randroid. So as a Randroid, you spoke with her? What was that like? Tell me that story.
Sure. So in the 70s, I was going to graduate school at the New School in New York, and Peikoff and Blumenthal gave us different lecture courses.
This is Nathaniel Branden when he was still Blumenthal? Or no, you mean
Nathaniel Branden? This was later. This was after. I didn't get interested until after they broke up.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and so Peikoff, but the people involved with Ayn Rand were still giving lecture courses at the same place as they had NBI, Statler Hilton.
Uh-huh.
And I went to some of them with my husband, John. And she was always there in the audience, and she would stand around and, you know, be available. You could go up and talk to her. And basically, I think what happened was a lot of people were intimidated about talking to her, but my mother was always yelling at me, so I was used to that. I thought, well, if she gets mad for some reason or anything,
I can handle it.
Because I'd seen her at Ford Hall Forum and other places get quite worked up with some people and some questions, But it never happened with me with my questions. She always talked to me so nicely. She listened very carefully to what I said, and then she would try to answer it to the best of her ability. And even sometimes, I knew I must not have asked the question well or something. She didn't get what I was asking. I'd say, no, I mean this. She would stop and she would reformulate what she had to say. And we talked about all kinds of things. I mean, whether it was, do animals have some aspect of free will, to cats, to plastic jewelry. Okay. I mean, just all kinds of subjects. She was really excited one time when I said, oh, how would you cast Atlas Shrugged? And she said, and then we, threw out different suggestions and everything. And then she said, now, this is the kind of conversation I like, so she really enjoyed that. Yeah. So she was really delightful to me. She did one time get angry, and that's because I was I was waiting for her while she was talking to somebody else, and I was making conversation with Frank O'Connor, her husband. And I knew at that point that he had aphasia. He had a hard time. He must have had a stroke or something, and he had a hard time formulating his sentences. So I was just asking him about his painting and asking questions that he could easily answer. And she kept looking over at me, and she kept looking angrier and angrier until finally she said, don't bother him. He's not an objectivist, he's my husband, or something like that. In other words, indicating he wasn't doing intellectual. He wasn't an intellectual to talk to. Also, she was very protective of him at that point when he was ill.
I can imagine.
And so I kind of shrugged my shoulders because I knew she didn't know. I hadn't asked him anything like that, and I walked away. And then during the break between the lectures, she came over and found me. And she said, darling, please forgive me. I didn't know what you were talking about. And that was it. And I just thought, never did she act like she was the great Ayn Rand and you were a peon. It was always mind to mind talking to her,
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that fits how I understand her. I also imagine that the intelligence and the earnestness of your questions led her to say, this is a real opportunity of a real human being that I can connect with, versus the people that she historically gets mad at in the question and answers, or on Donahue or wherever. It's because the questions are not earnest. The questions there's subterfuge in it, and it's...
Yeah, there's usually an agenda. I mean, sometimes I saw her answer get like that with people that I thought were asking. Rarely I did see that where I thought they were asking honest questions, but I think you're right, because years later after this happened, I met this woman named Ellen Stuttle. Okay, and she is a psychologist. She's married to a physicist, Larry Gould, who been involved in objectivism since the 60s. And Ellen said, oh, I know you, but you don't know me. And I said, what do you mean? She said, oh, I used to sit in front of Ayn Rand so I could eavesdrop on her conversations. And she said, and Ayn Rand talked to you differently than anybody else. And she said she thought it was because I was asking, I really sincerely wanted to know the answers to the questions, so.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay. And so then through your career, you've ended up in this program called The Great Connections. So I want to get into that, and I want to get into it from a particular angle. You can say, sure. My whole focus is not so much the philosophical argument side of Ayn Rand, although I love that, of course, right? It's how do you use this practically? How do you take these ideas, apply them in your life, apply them in your relationships? How do you lead teams? How do you facilitate people coming into this heroic way of being that's integrated, where it's absolutely heroic and romantic and beautiful and following your highest vision of what's possible, in a way that works with other people, and you're really taking responsibility for yourself and reason connected to reality. This thing. And from my perspective, the work that you're doing is taking this way of being, this fundamentally Ayn Rand hero way of being, out into the world in a way that people are actually accepting it and using it and growing and incorporating into their lifestyle. And it's like, this, from my perspective, this is what we need. We've got plenty of people who can argue Ayn Rand. What I want is people who are going out in the world and actually teaching the ideas in a way that people use it, the methods, not the you must agree, but here's how to think about it. And it seems to me that that's what you're doing. So could you describe your work and how you got into it and what is you're attempting to do? And then we can go through your various programs to see how do they serve the kind of thing that I'm just talking about.
Sure. So I've been interested in education for a long time because I really loved school, but I was frustrated by the other people in school because a lot of them were goofing around until I realized that they were really unhappy with how they were learning. So then I said, okay, and I also didn't like the social atmosphere in school because I was subject to a lot of teasing, a lot of nastiness from other kids, and for various reasons. And so I thought, okay, I want some other kind of school situation for my kids when I have them. And I kind of had my eye open for that. And when I read, there were some articles in the Objectivist about the Montessori method that Beatrice Hessen wrote. Beatrice Hessen was the wife of Montessorian and was the wife of the historian Bob Hessen. And so I read them and I said, this sounds exactly like what I would like. So then I went out and I educated myself about Montessori. I read everything I could get a hold of. And then I also went and visited Montessori schools, and I became pretty convinced, okay, that's what I want for my kids. So I put my oldest child into a well-established Montessori preschool here in the Chicago area in my neighborhood. And but when he got to elementary, I didn't like the choices. There was a Montessori magnet program in the local public school, but it was really a crapshoot. You know, if you were in one classroom, you had a teacher who really knew how to implement Montessori. If you were in the other one, they didn't know what they were doing. So I didn't want that. Because Montessori is it's like Objectivism in the sense that it's a very complex, really well thought out and integrated system of education, quite different than traditional education because it's very much focused on nurturing the independent development of the child. So you can see how it goes hand in glove
with Objectivism, yeah.
Right, exactly. And so I ended up, in the long run, what happened was with some friends, I founded a Montessori elementary school in our neighborhood, and my kids went there to 8th grade. And so I was very interested in Montessori, but my own level of teaching interest, I ran the school. I basically was teaching the teachers and the other people involved in the school a lot about, well, what attitude should you have and how do you deal with each other and how do you work with the parents and all that kind of thing.
You were working at the level of how does all of this integrate together? Right,
yeah. And also with a lot of Montessori schools, the heads of the schools are great with the kids, but they do not know how to treat the other adults. It's ironic to me that they know how to be very respectful towards the kids, but when it comes to the adults that work for them, they don't seem to know how to deal with them well. I think I came to the conclusion that first of all, you have to be able to transfer the ideas from what do you do in the child level to what do you do at the adult level. And then you also have to have the self-confidence to not be challenged, personally challenged by anybody pushing back against you or arguing with you, or, there's all the ego things that go on with interacting with other adults.
Yeah.
So I think it's something like that. I think that's one of the main problems. But anyway, so back in the late 90s, I could see what was going on in colleges. Now, I had read Rand's article, The Comprachicos, back in the 70s, and she basically predicted what is happening today in the colleges with the leftist takeover, with the kids not knowing any of the great ideas, with them not being taught how to reason at all. Their whole scope of understanding is totally shrunken, and the super emphasis on social relationships. What tribe are you? Are you in the feminist tribe? Are you in the LGBT tribe? Are you in the whatever? The super emphasis on that. So I saw that was happening back in the 1990s, and I was concerned about what's happening to young people. And I thought, well, I think we need our own program, because one of the things is the left already was owning the collectivists were already owning the university so much that they would not allow other people to teach the ideas. It was really hard to get any free market ideas, certainly not Ayn Rand, into the regular university programs. So I thought, well, we should have our own program. And you know what? It's such a great philosophy and approach to learning to base ideas on that the kids should be able to flourish and actually academically rocket ahead, So I originally had the idea about starting our own college, and worked on that, made this organization, worked on that, and was going around trying to drum up support for it when the 2008 crash happened.
Yes.
And that scared everybody with capital like crazy, right? And so I revamped, and I said, okay, well, I'll do a summer program, and it'll show the effectiveness of this. So what I did in the summer, what I've done in the program is integrate a very reason and evidence-oriented approach that we use in everything that we do. Also integrating ideas across domains. So in the summer program, we learn ideas from physics to philosophy, poetry, history. We read texts on all of those. I always include art in it and talk about art and show people, if you look at art yourself, what are you getting from it? So we'll have a lesson on looking at a painting or a sculpture and knowing absolutely nothing about it, and just talking about what is the effect that it's having on you, and what is it about that artwork that's giving you that effect. And so we have a conversation about that, like a dialogue between us. I'll teach them about, we've done all the programs, or most of the programs actually, in Chicago, the week-long ones. And so I'll teach a little bit about the history of Chicago, because people tend to take for granted whatever is around you, and they don't realize, how did it get here, right?
Yes.
How did it get here? Look at the amazing stuff.
The amazing miracle that we live in all the time, that we just take for granted, when it's the realization beyond the dreams of avarice of kings of yesterday. Like, it's so amazing, and we just take it all for granted to be able to bring that. So studying Chicago as a way of like bringing that to light sounds fantastic. Sorry, please continue.
I mean, Louis XIV did not have indoor plumbing like we have, okay? Yeah. So, I mean, even the poorest person in the United States has indoor plumbing. That is amazing. And but the Chicago is a really interesting town in this respect, because it's super man-made. And the reason I say that is for several reasons. One is that it was originally, it's settled here because of the river connecting to Lake Michigan, which connects to the St. Lawrence Seaway, which connects to the Atlantic Ocean, and the Chicago River connects to the Mississippi in a long series of canals and things. So it's a big transcontinental transportation point. But it was originally this swampy waterfront, okay? Not what we have now. If anybody's been to Chicago now, we have this like amazing 29 miles of beach. We have a beautiful skyscrapers. You can go to the beach, beautiful water, and look at skyscrapers at the same time. You can go boating. You can go on the trains. Just all kinds. It's a beautifully laid out, and that's because the city was burned down in 1871 from a fire, and that's how it became a big architecture center and drew all these famous architects like Frank Lloyd Wright and Adler and Sullivan. And what happened was there was a movement at the end of the 19th century called the Beautiful City Movement. And so Chicago had been like this really dirty industrial town, stockyards, all these, the Chicago River would go on fire because of all the stuff just spontaneously go on fire because of all the stuff poured into it by the factories and all this. Well, then the commercial club of the city kind of looked at all this and said, no, we want Chicago to be a real beautiful city and a hub of everything. We're going to redo it. Montgomery Ward, if anybody remembers, there used to be a department store named Montgomery Ward. Well, it was started in Chicago, and he personally did a lot of fighting to make sure that we had all this beautiful lakefront, and it wasn't used for industrial use, but it had open recreation and parks and all this. And they hired Daniel Burnham, who was the architect of the Chicago Columbian Exposition in 1893, and of many other things. They hired him to do a plan for Chicago, and it's an absolutely plan of genius in the way he laid out the city to make it really functional and beautiful. They did things like reverse the course of the Chicago River away from the lake so that it would stop polluting the lake. They raised the land. They raised everything up 20 feet from the actual level where it was like the Chicago River level because of problems with sewage. And they wanted to keep all the buildings and everything away from it. So there's just so much about it. They got all the sand from the sand dunes in Gary, Indiana, where they were making the steel mills. And so they took those sand dunes down and used them to make beaches in Chicago. And it's just a really interesting story, you know. So it gets people to think about, wow, how did all this get here?
Yes. And the individuals and the creativity and the work and the planning and the rationality and the working with reality in order to create something that's going to last. Right. Like that kind of thinking is, again, it brings it down into reality.
Exactly. I mean, I like to think about a skyscraper and how mind-boggling it is to think of all of the tools that had to be invented to make that skyscraper, not just to build it, but to find all the materials and mine the materials and change them into whatever you want. I mean, it's just mind-boggling how many tools were created to do that, you know. So we'll do that kind of thing. And in the classroom part of it, we use a very specialized methodology that's called a Socratic Seminar. But a very, you know, that term is used in a lot of different ways. And there was a show in the 70s called The Paper Chase about law school, in which the Socratic questions basically were like got you questions to the students. It's not like that at all. It's a seminar in which we all read the same text, or maybe we all look at the same artwork, and we have a conversation with each other about what is the meaning of that text. Do I think it's true or false? And how is it connected to reality? How does it relate to my own experience? How do I relate it to other things that I've read? And it's very much the teacher in this situation does two important things. One is they are the selector of the text. So you want to find something that's really rich to use. So there's a lot of meat to talk about. And in my case, I always find texts that relate to each other. Not always obviously, but one of the things I do with the students is I encourage them to find the connections. Why are we reading this? Why are we reading Newton and then we're reading this article about love? How is that related? And in the discussions, the second important thing the teacher does is the teacher is the facilitator of the discussions, not the authority about the material. So what you're trying to encourage is everyone in the discussion to be thinking for themselves about what does the text mean. First, do we understand it? And we have a dialogue about that. And then, well, what are the implications of that? And what is the meaning of that? And what are the connections of that? What the teacher does is try to get the students to figure those things out with their own questions and trying to answer certain questions, you know. So this methodology, the reason why I chose this is that it really increases independent reasoning power and the self-confidence of the students, because they come away saying, wow, I can understand anything firsthand. I don't need an authority to read a physics article, or I don't need an authority to read a poem. I can look at it myself, and I've learned a lot about how to do that in this discussion. The other thing is a benefit of doing it in a group is that you hear how other people reason about the same thing that you're reasoning about, and they often notice things that you didn't notice or come at it or have an idea about it in a way that you didn't, and it expands your repertoire of thinking. So you come away from a whole week, the kids come away from a whole week of intensely doing this kind of thing in 2 or 3 sessions a day in all different subject areas. And they come away with tremendous self-confidence and a whole new level of reasoning ability. And they end up having very close relationships with each other because the way you facilitate this discussion, it's very supportive of each other. It's not a debate, it's a dialogue. And so if somebody says something you disagree with it, you say, well, could you tell me more about that? Or why do you think that? Or what's your evidence for it? Or where did you see this in the text? Or I think about this differently. And then you explain it. And this way you have a meeting of minds. You start to understand each other's terms. You are both looking at the same material, so the facts can speak for themselves. You don't bring in a lot of outside information, because if you start lecturing to me, if we're reading something from Kant, and you start lecturing to me about Kant and what he meant and his history and all this, I can't verify it. I can only verify what's right in front of us that we both know together. So
and it shifts the conversation back into authority rather than having actually discovering the thinking. It sounds like you're essentially provoking the students to learn to articulate their own thinking, and in the process come to trust themselves in that, and come to, like, through interaction and dialogue, to actually recognize what it is they think, and giving them methods so that they can think through how they think in conversation, so that they learn how to think.
Exactly. That's exactly the idea. And most students are not introduced to thinking for themselves in the rest of their career, because especially nowadays, the whole system is about, well, learn a bunch of this stuff and then take a test. Learn about that stuff and then take a test. And discussion is not encouraged. And of course, with all the pressure from the collectivists, if you do disagree, you're often given the argument from intimidation. Oh, how could you think that? Or who are you to think that? Instead of, well, what are your reasons? So the kids are really, they amazingly, they have often said to me, I feel like my life has been transformed. Because, and they go away, you'll see somebody who's really shy come to the program. They might not talk for a long time. And one of the things that we teach in the dialogue is to encourage, to notice other people in the dialogue and whether they have something to say. So the person who tends to talk a lot learns better social skills by starting to notice the other people, and maybe they have something to say. And the shy person, who often has tremendous things to say because they're quietly listening to everybody else and they're coming up with all kinds of things that you haven't heard, is now encouraged to be more forthcoming, because they're given the self-confidence that if they say something, it's worthwhile and other people are really interested in it. So it really develops people's social skills, which are great for when you go to work, right? When you're working on a job, you want to know how to treat other people in a way that they feel like they're listened to and that you can convey your ideas to them so you can work as a team. So you become kind of a team in this, especially when you have the same group over a whole week. They develop a whole ethic of how to talk to each other. They get to know each other, and they know who's shy, and they'll start, saying something to them. And it was very interesting. I had this young boy, really, really bright, 16, and he talked all the time. And we kept trying to gently, encourage him to listen a little more. Well, at one point, I gave him the job of what we call dialogue statistician, where he keeps a tally of all the people who said what, how many times, and things like that. And then afterwards, we can reflect on that, And after he did that, he said, now I understand what you mean about paying attention to other people. It was really interesting, And there's all different methods we'll use. There's a thing called inner circle, outer circle, where you have half of the group doing the dialogue and half of the group observing. And their job is to then at the end give reflective feedback about how did that dialogue go? Like did people really pay attention to each other? Did they use reasons and evidence? Well, when you're in the outer circle, and that's your job, you're really paying attention to how people are interacting. And then you take those skills back into the circle when it's your turn to be in the inner circle. So
yeah, it's great. And again, what I hear going through all of this is that there is a method. And the method is, how do you get people to think in connection with reality and take responsibility for their thinking?
Right.
To really own it and recognize, what do they think? What are their values? How do they understand it? And what does it mean to them? And then how to interact with others. How do you actually team up with others to discover what's next? I have a metaphor I like to use, which is like, this is you could say, what is this? And you say, oh, it's a pen. And yes, and then the answer is right. But the question is, well, what else is it? Well, it's a cylinder. Yes, it's orange. Yes, it's plastic. Yes, it's under a pound.
Right.
And each one of these is a different dimension of the same thing. It's independent. But if I only say it, the difference between debate and dialogue, as I like to think about it, is debate is someone says, it's orange, and the other person says, no, it's a cylinder. And they say, no, it's orange. No, it's a cylinder, right? And it's like they're fighting for a perspective rather than recognizing both perspectives. And it sounds like your method invites people to take perspective so that they have a multi-dimensional understanding of the thing. And it's that integration that matters.
And the thing is, the psychological environment is very important, and the physical environment too. Like, you want a physical environment where everybody in the group can see each other so that they can pay attention to what the other person is saying, and they can see who's doing what and who wants to talk. But remember that, I mean, I'm sure you know this, that a person's self-image is one of the tenderest things in you psychologically, and the most important. And so people will tend to protect that first rather than anything else. And so what you, in so many learning situations, your self-image is put on the spot. Are you the smartest one? Do you have the right answer? How do you look? Did you say it the right way?
Are you speaking in alignment with the right tribe? Are you taking the right enemies? And are you claiming the right virtues?
Exactly. All those kinds of things. So what we want to do is eliminate that in this discussion. So it's just like in Montessori school, where you eliminate that kind of thing so that the kid can pay attention to actually learning, where learning becomes the primary thing that you're doing. And in this case, you're learning together. You're trying to think together. You're trying to think well together, because everything you say, you have to try to give your reasons for it. I mean, but we're not, it's not like we're going to come down hard on somebody if they don't have an immediate reason for it. We'll try to help them if they have an intuition that there's something about this that they don't like, or they're trying to get at a certain idea. We'll encourage them to try to think that out and make it more conscious. Because
to come to terms with their own thinking.
Exactly, right.
Yeah. And I like how you say that. So, because if you were to criticize them, and like, oh, don't you have a reason? Right? Now, that way of speaking, that focusing is going to put their attention back on their self-image. Now they have to protect their ego. And the way I like to describe it is, like, when you have your attention on whether or not you're looking good, on whether or not, like, you're protecting your ego, that takes so much mental bandwidth that you just don't have enough to think the real thoughts you need to think to solve the problem. To actually learn and become who you want to be. It's like you're spending more and more of your time in this self-image game rather than in actually making your life better, actually understanding, right, how to integrate these various pieces.
Exactly.
Well, so that's your weekend and your week-long program. You're doing a program now called the Gap Year. What's that like to have? Sure. To have a year, and what is your intention that you're offering? What is it that you learn things from the weeks? What happens when you string 10 or 20 of those together? Right.
Well, the weekend ones are very compressed experiences. Those I'm able to do lots of different places, so I'll be invited to California or New York or Atlanta, Buenos Aires, Guatemala, different places to do it. The week-long ones are kind of a compressed experience of the bigger program. And by the end of it, you couldn't keep that up if you did it multiple weeks, because everyone's just totally exhausted by the end. They're exhilarated and exhausted at the same time. But so what I've done is create a program which is in 3 parts. The first trimester will focus on the basic questions you're trying. Okay, a gap year is a year that people take between high school and college, or maybe even they drop out of college because they're not sure what they're doing and they take a year off. Most people work or they travel or something like that. And there's a lot of programs to do that kind of thing. They might send you to an Australian sheep farm, or they might you might sail around the world. I mean, these are for rich people too, you know. But most of them are not academic. And ours is somewhat academic in the sense that we're going to be reading great texts. We always draw from what's called the great books or the classics. Now, why is that? These are books that have been edged out of the curriculum in college because of the dead white males, you know, on that whole thing. Well, the reason why they're the great books is these are the greatest thinkers that have grappled with the deep questions of human life throughout the ages, and they're still with us. Why are they with us? Because they say so much that people keep reading them, you know. So this is why they're important. And in fact, they're probably 99% male. But so what? I mean, are they good ideas or not? It's like one time a friend of mine said something about, she's a teacher, said something about logic and how, oh, you know, that's a Western way of doing things. And I'm like, no, it's not. I said, this is the human way of thinking. And it's a universal truth. So it's not just from the West. We may have figured it out in the West. I mean, Aristotle and the other thinkers may have figured it out, but
we've formalized it. We've refined it into a series of art forms, but it's fundamental.
It's good for everybody, and everybody can adopt it. It's human. So, what was I saying? So we read from the classics mostly. And then, but we also always include some texts from Ayn Rand and also from the other free society thinkers, because these people are not usually included in curricula in the high schools or the colleges. So we might read Marx, and then we might read Mises. And then the students have an opportunity to compare their writing and their thinking and the evidence that they give. And so for the gap year program, it will be about deep questions about, well, how do I know? How do I know what's true or false? How do I know how to think well? How should I live my life? How should I live with other people? Those are going to be the focuses in the first 10 weeks of the program. Mm-hmm. And that'll also be combined with classes in improv comedy. Why is that? Well, we want to learn a lot and have fun doing it. Uh-huh. And improv comedy, believe it or not, those skills are very good for learning how to get along with other people. Because one of the basic principles is yes and. Whatever the crazy thing that person is doing in the scene, you're going along with it. Mm-hmm. So it helps to learn how to collaborate.
Yeah, and that helps you pull out, okay, what is the perspective that they're bringing, and where is the value in that perspective, rather than that perspective is different than mine, therefore I'm going to discount it, breaking the relationship and oversimplifying my world.
Exactly. And that's why improv comedy is so creative. I don't know how many of the viewers have ever gone to see a really good show, but it's just amazing what they'll come up with. And they probably know Saturday Night Live. Mm-hmm. Well, the many of the current and all the original players in Saturday Night Live came from Chicago's Second City Improv Comedy Club. So gives you an idea of the kind of crazy thing. I mean, remember John Belushi and the Bees?
Yes.
Or the Samurai dry cleaners? Crazy ideas, right?
Yes, crazy. And once they start with them, they go with it, and it leads unexpected places, which leads to these crazy ideas.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's the first part of the program.
Right. And it also includes we have a teacher who is an expert in writing. He studied Shakespeare at the University of Chicago. He studied in the great books, and then he went on to a 25-year career in advertising as a creative director. And he's put together this fantastic writing program using Aristotle's rhetoric and the classics of rhetoric that Shakespeare used, but explaining teaching the kids how to learn the way professionals write, the way they get things done, writing to get things done. Whether you're a novelist or you're a general or you're an advertising executive or you're a screenwriter, how do you do it? In school, we're mainly learn how to write expositionally because the teachers want to use it to find out, did you understand the material? But there's many different things. You want to persuade, you want to illustrate, you want to express gratitude, you want to respond to what somebody's demanding of you.
You want to build relationship and shared
Right.
understanding and shared values and a context from which to move forward.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we've got that. So that'll be going on throughout the year. In the middle of the year, we want the kids to get in small groups, depending on their interests, to pick out a real world problem that they're going to try to solve. And we'll connect them up with very accomplished professionals in whatever field it is, whether it's business, science, art, the trades, crafts. It'll depend on what the kids are interested in. And they'll be working on that for 10 weeks. They'll also have a little more reading to do, and they'll be keeping in contact with their tutors. Throughout, we have built in individual meetings every week with the tutors or the teachers in the program, so that the student can go over, well, what is their progress and what are they thinking about this and what do they want to do next, and well, what do they need to do to figure that out, and how do they build their portfolio of work so that they can use that as a reference for whatever they want to go on to do next. So that'll be going on. The last 10 weeks, we're going to focus on things like personal finance, economics, the marketplace, entrepreneurship, and the role of art in a well-lived life. So.
Okay, cool. So, and who is this program meant for? Is there an age group, 18 to 24, or
Yes, 18 to 24, and I mean, I'm not super. If somebody was 25 and they wanted to come, I wouldn't say no. But it's for people who are trying to figure out what to do with their life, and the idea is to prepare yourself so well that when you go, if you're going on to college, you're going to go right through, because right now only 36% of all enrollees are graduating in 4 years. And every year, I mean, is that mind-boggling or what? Every year that you add to your college career is another approximately $25,000. So this is partly for parents who want their child to really know what they want to do
and get it done.
Exactly, and get it done. And I've heard so many stories from very accomplished adults who goofed around for a couple of years because they didn't know what they were doing and wasted time and money until they figured it out, and then they buckled down and they were ready to go right through. I know, Craig Ventnor. He was in Celera Genomics. They had a machine that analyzed the human genome 15 years before the government scientists were going to do it. Anyway, he went to high school. He got drafted. He was I think he was a surfer first because he didn't want to go to college. Then he got drafted. He was made a medic, and that got him interested in medicine. So he went out and got an MD, PhD, and then he became this big biotech researcher. But he was fooling around as a surfer for a couple of years because he didn't know what he wanted to do. So this is what we want. We want to help kids be able to know what they want to do. Even the kids that have done very well in high school and they've crossed all the T's and dotted the I's, and they've been in extracurricular and got the A's and all this, they very often go to college and they're at a loss because they're not used to figuring out for themselves what to do.
Yeah, and then
everybody else's program.
And up until that point, you could say, especially if that's been their path, they've been very good at figuring out what's expected of them and then doing what's expected of them. Exactly. And then if they go to college, now they're getting all of these new things and they're still adapting themselves to that. Versus, it sounds like what you're really doing is you're saying, that's all good. Like, you want to be able to adapt to the situation. You want to be able to have the kinds of conversations. Like I said, we're going to improve your social skills. We're going to have you learn when to speak, when to listen, how to build a dialogue rather than sequential monologues. Right. But even more, what you're doing is you're learning how to think. You're learning how to decide, what do you think? What do you want? How are you going to choose? And you could say that's the master skill. There's a lot of contexts in which you could get good. Oh, I can learn how to do this, and I can learn how to do this. But the question is, like, is this the tree I want to climb? I can climb this tree, but is this the tree I want to climb? Is this the mountain that I want to take on? I've never thought about that. I want to be able to think about really, what do I think? What do I want?
Exactly.
Right? To be able to trust yourself because you've got a method and because it just makes so much sense. Like once you learn this stuff, you can do that. And then if you go to college, it's my mom went to college after my brother and I grew up and moved out, right?
Yeah.
She went back to college and she loved it because she knew what she wanted to do. She was clear about who she was. And the GAP program that you're doing, the Great Connections, is it called the Great Connections GAP program?
We call it the leap year, with the hope that will help them leap into their future.
Yes, nice. And I like leap year. It's like this special year that's like an extra. There's like a little extra to it. Yeah. Okay.
And it could be, if a person is really well organized, they could get through college a lot faster too.
Oh,
could get through it in 3 years instead of 4 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, once you know how to stop and say, wait a minute, how will I decide which classes to take?
Exactly.
When I got into college, it's just like, okay, I need to take some of these classes. What's available? I just took whatever was available. It's not like I stopped and went, what are the classes that I want to take? How does this serve me? I knew I was going into psychology, so I was going to take the various psychology courses, but I didn't really think. And it wasn't until like the end of my first quarter, I'm all like, that was a whirlwind. Mm-hmm. What do I want to do? Mm-hmm. This is actually my life. And I started...
Exactly, right?
Right. I started thinking about it. And so I appreciate, I wish I had a leap year. Right. Especially to be introduced to rational thinking and to be introduced to these, for lack of a better term, libertarian ideas. Mm-hmm. Right. These ideas of individual freedom. Mm-hmm. Of respecting people as an individual, about being an individual, and about how the individual interacts with society in a way that honors the individual. Because that's not the dominant narrative. On either side of the tribal wars, it's like, who do you serve?
Exactly.
Right? Do you serve your tribe? Or do you serve this tribe? Like, it's always in service of other things rather than who are you and how does that play out?
Exactly.
So...
can I just say something about that?
Please.
So, and the way I think of it is, reason and evidence is on the side of a free society. And if you understand that and you're very well developed in your autonomy, because what we're really talking about is individual autonomy, you do not want to be ruled. So this is part of my idea is I'm helping these young people learn how to be autonomous. They're not going to be inclined to be ruled by other people if they are very autonomous. And the facts of the matter are on the side of a free society, so they'll be more receptive to those ideas too. Because I don't want to indoctrinate. That's the opposite of respecting individual autonomy. But I do think certain things are true and certain things are right. And I'm going to present the evidence and the reasons for those, that for these ideas that in the main are not being presented in other places, and then let the young people choose themselves. But I think that the tendency would be to be more pro-freedom because of it. So this is how I'm trying to create circumstances where people will want to live in a free society and will be attracted to those ideas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, near the beginning, we spoke about... I said that Ayn Rand had the idea that it seems that there's a concerted effort by a large group of people to get people to doubt reason and to doubt reality. Mm-hmm. Because if you can get people to doubt reason and doubt reality, then they won't critically examine your ideas. And then if you can have a really emotionally compelling idea, you can present the emotionally compelling idea, and that will win the day because there aren't any legitimate ways to question it.
Exactly.
Right? And that opens the door for all kinds of tribal premises. Right? Like, here, are you part of the tribe?
Demagoguery and tyranny.
Yes. And that what you're doing, and you could say the part of what you're doing with Great Connections, it seems to me consistent with Ayn Rand, if not, you're not teaching Ayn Rand, although you study some of her texts, right? The part that's consistent with that is you're saying, no. We use reason to connect with reality so that our ethics, we can actually examine our ethics. What do you think about that? We can examine our politics. Is it fair? Is it just? Do you want to be able to do your own thing or not? And the more we expand those, it's like, what does it mean to be heroic? What do you see in art? How does it touch you? All of this is bringing people into being the authority of their life, not from a, like, I choose it, but because it makes sense. I've examined it. You checked your premises. And now you're creating a program that encourages people to check their premises, because when you check your own premises, you become your own authority. You become the author of your life.
Exactly.
Right. And that, as you say, that's on the side of liberty and freedom.
Right. Exactly.
And free markets and those types of things.
Well, I mean, because if you look at the history, when did the ideas of freedom arise? They were during the Age of Enlightenment, when reason was considered the way to think about things, right? Reason, we'd come out of the Middle Ages, they started to experiment and think about things in a rational way. We developed science, and then the way of using reason spread to using it for everything. And that's where the thinkers like John Locke came up with the idea of how a government should be and how why individual rights should be respected, and ended up getting embedded in our Constitution and Bill of Rights and Declaration. So,
yes, and to the degree that we can get people to think, to the degree that we can get people to critically examine, to check their premises, and to actually look to reality. How does this play out in reality? How would this affect you? Let's say that you, in the philosophical detection essay, if you were to live this, imagine what would happen in reality as you play out this scenario. And you could say a lot of that's what Rand did in her fiction. She said, let's take this premise and actually play it out. What happens when someone with this premise interacts with someone with this premise? What happens?
Exactly. Yes.
Okay, so with the Great Connections, you're really focused on the method. Right? How do you get people to take authority, to be able to trust themselves because they've got a method that they can trust, that they recognize this is superior. I'm actually thinking it through. I'm clarifying my thinking. This is more real when I do it this way. So you give them this method, but you also, like, you've written a couple articles for Real Clear Politics on capitalism versus, and the how it is that socialists ignore the consequences of socialism in the 20th century, right? So you're writing about that. That's very much, you could say, on the conclusion side more than the methodology side. Although it seems to me in reading it that your method shines through.
Thanks.
Right? And then you even wrote an essay on art and on Greek sculpture that you like. How do you bring, you could say, your more objectivist, Ayn Rand influenced ideas into the world outside of Great Connections, since Great Connections is so focused on the method rather than Ayn Rand? How does that play out for you?
Well, just to go back to the Great Connections, I do want to mention one thing. We always include essays by her, especially Philosophy Who Needs It and Philosophical Detection and the Objectivist Ethics. Sometimes we might include other things, but I try to keep it, I don't want to overwhelm kids with, because it's not an Ayn Rand philosophy seminar. It's about all kinds of ideas. But she sets the stage. She helps them understand why they should even be paying attention to philosophy. And also what we found is that they love, especially the objectivist ethics essay, because she starts at the beginning and asks not what's good or bad, but what is value?
Why do we need
value?
good and bad?
And that itself is a lesson in method, right? And how you should go
Yes.
about thinking about things. And then she connects everything together. So one of the things that we're doing is she's being read as an equal to the other great thinkers. So there's another implication of the way that the seminar is set up. As far as out in the world, you're looking quizzical, like you didn't understand what I meant.
Oh, no, I understand.
Okay. As far as what I'm doing in the world is, I'm writing these other essays to try arguing. I tell you one thing, I am so sick and tired of the leftists pushing their collectivism and totally ignoring the death that comes from it. And of course, we've seen Venezuela is the most recent example. So I just got all worked up about that and wrote that article about capitalism, because it's just amazing how they will totally ignore the consequences. And why is that? Because they want to insist that taking care of other people is the highest value, and that's the right way to act. And the thing is that morality always trumps practicality. So if people think something is the right way to live, or the good, or what God said, or the perfect thing to do, they're going to do it regardless of the consequences, or many people will, regardless of the consequences.
Especially if they have been taught that they don't need to be philosophically consistent and they don't need to test to see how their ideas work out in reality.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So, and I remember in 2009, I was hired there was a little college, a great books college here in Illinois named Shimer that had gotten in a bad way. There were only about 100 students, and the Heartland Institute, who is a free market think tank, were trying to get some free market ideas into there, or thought they might be able to help the college and develop something new. So they had me teach a course called The Morality of Capitalism. Yes. And what I did was I paired writers, starting with Plato, who were pro and anti kind of free society ideas. But the leftists had so indoctrinated the students already, even though they were teaching great books, that they just gave me a huge fight through the whole course, So this is what's going on. And
so this brings me back to another, you could say, fascination that it's something I'm fascinated with, that you have a specific kind of experience with. I take these ideas out into the world. This is what I do. I'm a coach, I'm a trainer, I'm an evangelist, I'm fascinated by this. These are the kinds of conversations I like to have. And it is fascinating to see the various responses that I get and how those responses have been changing over time. Right?
What have you seen?
What?
What have you seen when you say they've been changing?
It used to be that I would have a conversation that might lead into an argument, in which I would go, okay, we might be talking about politics, and then we say, well, politics actually leads down into ethics, and so then we'd have a conversation about, well, what's the ethics that you're using? What's the epistemology that justifies your ethics, and what's your relationship to reality, right? So there's this, you could say, this legitimate argument to be had that follows the trace of ideas, and that would be a set of conversations, because I try to make it conversational. Like, what is it? What I'm finding is, as I move through time, to the degree that I disagree with any political conclusion, just the conversation ends. It's not that we then have a conversation, well, why do you think that? And what is it? It's like, if you think that, you are part of the wrong tribe, and therefore I'm going to write you off. And it reminds me a lot, when I was in college, I was a socialist, I was a Marxist, because of course, I mean, what else are you going to be if you're intelligent and you care about people? I'm a psychologist, right? Of course, I had never gotten any arguments against it.
Right.
I had never encountered a single argument against it. Right? And so I thought, this is the thing to do. And Marxism has this just great mental trick, and it's incredible. Brett Weinstein, I don't know if you're familiar with him and his story. He has a video called "How the Trick is Done," and he goes into this in great detail. But the thing that I learned from Marxism that was like a blunt hammer that I could use everywhere, which is, if you disagree with this fundamental premise, your thought is bourgeois. And therefore invalid, and therefore there's no point in having the conversation. I can write off everything that you say because I disagree with you on this one point. And I learned that. It's like, oh, I'm superior. You don't know this idea. You haven't integrated this postmodern Marxian idea into your thing. I can just write you off.
Right.
But that I found that was actually rare. I'm finding that more and more.
Yes.
That conversations just can't happen because I have been marked as in the wrong tribe, and that's it. What's that like for you dealing with college-age students who, it seems to me, are at the edge of this?
Yeah. Well, basically, it's the argument ad hominem. If you're talking about a logical fallacy,
yes,
which means against the man. In other words, for some reason, the man's character is invalidating whatever he's saying, and the truth or the facts of what he's saying are irrelevant just because his character is bad, because he believes X, Y, or Z, is gone crazy. It's rampant everywhere. This argument ad hominem, and also what Rand called the argument from intimidation, which is another side of it, which is, you believe that? Oh, that's so awful,
Yes.
without considering the facts, right?
Yes, and as Oscar Wilde said, you can't argue with a sneer.
Yeah, exactly, right? I was going to say, when I was at Scheimer, one of the things I did was I had the librarian get the Black Book of Communism, which was written by French communists who, after the fall of the wall, wanted to see whether this claim that there were so many deaths under communism were true. And they ended up finding out it was way worse than the conservatives or any free society person had even said. They ended up estimating it was between 60 and 100 million people were killed under communism. And the kids didn't even want to look at that book. They didn't even want to look at it. But I thought, oh, well, it's in the library, so somebody's going to run across it sometime, right? It's there. Well, where I run across this kind of thing the most is in our programs, because of the kind of the culture of the program, this very open and supportive discussion method, you get this kind of stuff going on. So that's helps, But when I run into it is online, and if you can make a comment or whatever, and you'll start getting the insults right away. So my whole approach is not to say anything about the insult except to say, that's an argument ad hominem. That's a logical fallacy. What is your evidence? What is your argument? And I'll just press people on that. If they continue with the insults, I'll just keep pressing them on it. And I'll keep saying, that's not an argument. That's a logical fallacy. And until they finally, either they shut up or they finally say something where they're trying to give a reason for it. And the reason I do that is, on the one hand, to push back against those people with reason, right? And on the other hand, to be an example for the people who are lurking. Because when you get into a lot of discussions online, there's the people you're talking to, and then there's the people that are just listening to the argument. And I want them to see what a rational argument is like, or what the rational approach is like. So, and that there is an alternative.
Again, you come back to the method. What is the method? Check your premises. How does this relate to reality? What is the logic that you're using? Right? What is that? I'm just noticing how you continually come back to method, because if you get the method right, if you actually take reason seriously and deal with reality, it serves as the basis for everything else.
Right. Well, and what you do is more powerful in terms of illustrating your ideas than what you say. How you act. Because you're showing how do these ideas work in action in your actual life. So that's why, I mean, when you get into these discussions where people are insulting you, you can't fall for insulting them back, because that's just going to their level. And it's hard sometimes because you get mad that they're saying stupid things to you, But remember, they really don't know you, and they really don't know what your ideas are, and they don't even understand the half of what you're saying. So just push back against them about, well, what do you mean? What's your evidence for things?
Yeah. So I'm imagining clarifying the ad hominem argument and showing its various forms, such that as the conversation happens, you can get people, like, when people do ad hominem, it breaks down the trust in the relationship. People get more and more into self-image. Their bandwidth gets taken away, and they can't talk as much. Exactly. How do the students take on this idea of ad hominem argumentation, that's not what we do here, when in social media, in the world they're coming from, like, that's all they hear? How well do they take that on? I'm curious about that.
The atmosphere is very friendly and supportive. And if somebody brings up an argument like that, we don't jump on them. We just say, that's not really a reason for things. What is your evidence for this? What are your reasons for it? And that's so much the focus. I mean, from the first class where we're studying a text, we're saying, okay, we start with, say, a 3-page text, and we might read it together, and then we'll say, do you have any questions? Or I might bring up a question about the text, and somebody will have an opinion. I say, well, where in the text are they saying something that makes you think that? So you're kind of insisting in the atmosphere on, well, let's look at the evidence, let's look at the reasons, and but not attacking the other person for their opinion. You're just politely asking them for their reasons, and so then it teaches everybody to get into that mode.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it seems that, especially in the last couple of years, the conversation has been becoming increasingly tribal, and there's a lot of deplatforming going on. Mm-hmm. And things like this. Jonathan Haidt and the FIRE guy wrote a book about
Greg
how...
Greg Lukianoff. Yeah.
Yes, Greg Lukianoff.
Well, and Dave Rubin was having a problem with being demonetized, and just all kinds of...
Yes.
Oh, and Sargon of Akkad, there's all those people that were having...
Right. And Jordan Peterson has become kind of a lightning rod in this process of someone who's willing to stand out. As I have become absolutely fascinated by him and his movement. Mm-hmm. I studied all of his work. I know it well. There are obviously points where his formulations are pragmatist and go against objectivism, but I really find a lot of common ground between them. And with charitable reading, I find him extraordinarily valuable. What do you think of that sort of movement, the Dave Rubins, the Sargon of Akkad, the Jordan Peterson? I'm sure you're watching this happen. What do you think? How do you read this in terms of where society's going, in terms of method, in terms of what kinds of conversations are possible in the intellectual dark web and such? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I think it's great. I mean, I'm so happy that they're doing what they're doing, and when you see the way, it's ironic that we have this pushback against free speech and free thought, but almost entirely in a private way, right? It's not the government stopping us from doing it. It's all these academics, intellectuals, they're using social pressure and intimidation to do it, right? Mm-hmm. So it's kind of interesting that it's from a private point of view. So, but I just think to myself, I am so glad we're in a country that has free speech, that really has free speech, really understands what that's about, and that you can have people who can go off and they can be a separate force to bring new ideas into the discussion and call out these people for what they're doing too, and criticize them without it getting into actual fistfights. I mean, we do know there's places where the thugs are really aiming to turn it into that. Like if you saw what happened in Portland last week, where the journalist was beaten up, but I mean, and that was because the government was not doing its job. The Portland mayor had told the police not to stop them. What the hell, right? So anyway, I that's got to cause a lot of people. But on the other hand, you see these people in Hong Kong. I mean, my gosh, they're standing up to the Chinese government, by the thousands. So
hundreds of thousands.
Yeah, there were 1 million people.
Yeah, I think 1 million people in a single demonstration. What?
It was 2 million people in that one demonstration, 1/4 of the population. And then today, I don't know if you saw that the Lam, who is the head of the government there, said that the extradition treaty is totally out of the picture now.
Wow.
Yeah.
Go Hong Kong.
Exactly, right?
May you preserve the charter that you were given, right? The thing that was negotiated when the English gave turned it over. There's a charter. May they keep it, because what an island of individual rights.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Right, against an entire continent where those rights are not respected.
Exactly, right? And that has an interesting history, where back in the early 1800s, the idea of free trade, because of Adam Smith, the idea of free trade had gotten to be very big in England. And so you had these free traders sailing all over the world, buying and selling goods with all these countries. But a bunch of the countries were closed up, like Japan and China. China hadn't been sailing since, I think, 1200. And the British traders were buying opium from Afghanistan, India, selling it to the Chinese, and buying silks and selling that to the Japanese. Mm-hmm. But the Chinese were very tightly controlling where they could do that. So the British didn't like it, and the free traders basically, the Chinese didn't know that Hong Kong was one of the greatest harbors in the world, because they weren't sailors. But the British, of course, knew. So the British traders petitioned Parliament to declare Hong Kong Island was almost uninhabited, so they had it declared British soil. And that's how they established it a free trade colony. That's how they established it as a free trade colony. Mm-hmm. And it was run, though, not like a democracy. It was run by a governor who just instituted British law there, and everybody who came there was treated under British law, which at that time, of course, was very pro-individual liberty. So it's an interesting case. For many years, it was the financial steam point for China, when it was in this really bad way. The people who were agitating and all that would escape to Hong Kong and kind of let the steam out of the country. But now, when China first opened itself up, Hong Kong's economy was something like 1/4 of their GDP. But now it's much smaller in proportion, because the rest of it has gotten big, But it's still really important in terms of maintaining freedom.
Yes. And again, it's such an extraordinary example of what a little capitalism will do.
Right, with no resources.
Right.
No resources on Hong Kong. It's all because of trade and freedom.
Yes. Yes.
You brought up the article I wrote about art, which was about the fabulous statues from ancient Greece called the Riachi bronzes. Mm-hmm. And I wrote that because I think there's two really important things that we who are advocates of free society need to be doing. One is really pushing on the argument that capitalism is the right moral system. And that's what my article on capitalism, it was called Capitalism is the Crucial Protector of the Smallest Minority, which is the individual.
Yes.
And we really need to be pressing that capitalism is the most moral way to run a society, because it allows people to follow their own path, to do what they want as long as they're following the law and they're not hurting other people. Mm-hmm. And allows people to determine their own life, not what other people think their life should be. Which the collectivists, that's what they always want to do. Starting with Plato's Republic, they're going to tell you what job you're going to have, where you're going to fit into society, and we're going to be the rulers. All the people, I always think the people who really push that point of view, they think they're going to be the ones in charge. They're not going to be the guys who are told to be a street sweeper, They always have that delusion because they're the smart ones. So
yes, where people are are promoting sacrifice, they're expecting to be the one who are receiving the sacrifice.
Exactly. Yeah. But the second thing I think that we on the Free Society side need to be doing is we need to produce a lot of art that embodies the worldview of what it's like to live in a free society. And, when I saw the Riachi bronzes, they convey this tremendous power and self-confidence that we should have, our country should have. We have many problems, but people are able to do, in so many respects, what they would like to do with their lives, especially compared to anywhere else in the world.
And any time in the world.
Exactly, at any time in the world. And that should be celebrated, and that should be embodied in art. But we don't have that much in the art around us, because art was captured also by the same people who believe in collectivism and all that. So, and the trouble is that this is one of the reasons why Rand was so influential, was she captured the ideas, the philosophy, and the point of view in art and made it palpable to you. Well, what's it like to live like that? And we need more of that, so people get the ideas that way. Also, I don't think you can really understand any of Rand's abstract essays without reference to her artwork as the illustrations of it. And I think people make mistakes sometimes reading her essays and trying to just reason from them without using that as a backdrop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Similarly, so this program is called Becoming an Ayn Rand Hero. Mm-hmm. And so it's really designed to use the concretization of her ideals, right? She put them into characters, so again, you can see how things play out. Mm-hmm. So that you can emulate those heroes. So you can say, here's what's possible.
Exactly.
Right? Here's who you could be. Here's how to think about it. Here's something to aspire to. Right? How do you make that? How do you make that happen? How do you project that?
Mm-hmm. How do you live it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for the conversation today. Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about before we sign off?
Just that if anybody's interested in any of our programs, come to our website, thegreatconnections.org, or you can write to me at info@thegreatconnections.org. We'd love to hear from you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Well, thank you, Marsha Familiaro Enright, right? Wife of John Enright. Thank you for your work, for your time, and for the joy that you've given me over the years. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, I really enjoyed the conversation, and I appreciate all the work you're doing. So.
Okay. Well, in the name of the best within us.
The Becoming an Ayn Rand Hero podcast is sponsored by the composer Darren John Lewis, whose music I use for this podcast. If you'd like a custom choral or symphonic piece for your special event or celebration, or if you'd just like to hear more of his music, go to darrenjohnlewis.com. That's DARINJOHNLEWIS.com.